Okay, welcome back. We're going to talk about some negative advanced strategies in this particular lecture. So, this will again kind of be going beyond the basics. I'm going to kind of assume that you have an understanding of different negative types of arguments, such as disadvantages, topicality, counterplans, etc. We're going to talk more on a higher level about how to make strategic decisions that maximize your ability to win. So, the first thing I want to really emphasize, and I say this from the perspective of a judge, is that where negative teams often go wrong is they don't talk enough about the affirmative case. They get a little bit too stuck on what they prepped, and they kind of get tunnel vision in terms of like only talking about what they prepped, and they don't fundamentally listen to what the affirmative says. They don't listen to their gut instincts. I'm going to give a great example just from my own career. um, this was in like the out rounds of the Point Loma tournament, and the resolution was really stupid. It was a metaphor resolution, which, if you know anything about it, it's just like you can't really prep for that when you're negative because you have no idea what the affirmative is going to argue. So my partner and I just did what we normally did, and we just prepped this very generic critique that is, it's just not the best argument, but at least it was something, right? Um, the affirmative got up and then presented this case about, I think it was like something to do with Russia, and I just was flowing the case and just listening to it, and I was just so like, I just had this gut instinct. This case is just bad. Like, it's so bad. What is this? But I had so much like tunnel vision. Like, I didn't listen to that inner voice that was like, you should say something about that. And I just went ahead and I read the critique that we prepped that didn't really touch on how bad their case was. That was a huge mistake because the other team was like fully expecting us to read that critique, and they had literally chosen to spend all their prep time just writing answers to that critique and just read a throwaway affirmative. So, in the end, the better decision in that debate would have been for me to literally just tear up everything we prepared and just spend 8 minutes talking about why their plan was hilarious and just wouldn't work, and maybe read a disadvantage or two off the top of my head. Always be flexible enough to just kind of do it live, right? Listen to what your opponent says. Think about in real time why it might not make sense, and just start writing down, like, here's all the reasons this doesn't make any sense. That can often be really, really useful for you. A great drill that I love to throw at students is what I call the disaster prep scenario, and it's where I tell a student, oh, you're prepping the affirmative, but I've lied. I'm actually going to make them the negative because I just want to challenge them. I want to see how they'll do in a scenario where they think they're negative, or they think they're affirmative, but they're actually negative, and all of a sudden they have nothing prepped. I think that that is incredibly valuable to practice because it forces you into that situation of having to basically on the fly do it live. Like, think about in real time, this is what the affirmative is saying and arguing, and like, here's what I'm going to argue against it. So I think that that is incredibly important. A related dimension of this, number two, is great negative debaters spend a lot of time on case. They plan to spend a lot of time on case. Even if it's not spontaneous, a good negative debater is going to be looking up tons of solvency deficit arguments, like reasons why the plan won't work. They're going to be looking at, they're going to be anticipating what are the advantages that the affirmative is going to run, and they're going to start prepping answers for that, right? They may not read those answers, but they're going to want to spend a lot of time on case. And the reason it's so important to spend a lot of time on case is you want to avoid giving the affirmative free wins, and you want to force them to have to fight through an absolute slog just to get back to square one. Put pressure on the member of government by extensively answering their cases. I would say, you know, at a bare minimum, try to read at least a couple responses to every contention. But the more responses you have to every contention, the harder it is going to be for the affirmative. It's just like the principle I talked about in the last lecture in terms of like, if you have a contention with like 15 or 20 different arguments in it, it's so hard to answer. But if you flip it around, right, if you're the negative and you have like 10, 15 answers to a contention, whew, trying to fight that uphill battle when you're affirmative is just awful. So spending a lot of time on case, even if it means just having one or two off-case arguments, can be a really strategic thing to do. Let's talk about some more specific arguments. Let's talk about disadvantages. The best disadvantages are going to be high impact, high probability scenarios, right? And you really want to diversify disadvantages. Make sure that if you're running more than one disadvantage, that they have very distinct scenarios, distinct impacts, so that you are putting eggs into multiple baskets. A lovely argument that I want you to know and to use is the phrase, "This disadvantage turns the case." What do you think that might mean?
The disadvantage turns this case.
Mm-hmm. The disadvantage turns the case.
Turns the case. That whatever that the affirmative was offering kind of gets turned in favor of the negation.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
If you go back to the OxyContin affirmative that I read for you in the last lecture, so if you didn't see the last lecture, that essentially he was arguing the plan would be to revoke the patent for OxyContin because the advantages that would solve the opioid crisis due to the overprescription of OxyContin. A disadvantage that would turn that case around on its head would be some kind of disadvantage that argues that actually the plan would increase or accelerate the opioid epidemic. That could be either directly or indirectly. Let's use an economy disadvantage as a sort of easy baseline to use. So the negative argues this plan is bad for the economy, that's going to cause a recession. How might economic decline foster opioid abuse?
The bad economy, it makes it harder for people to find a stable way of life, which then can often lead them to have to use drugs to cope with that. Okay. So you then make the opioid pandemic even worse because now you're having more people turn to drugs to try and cope with their hard life and how expensive everything is, that these drugs can give them an easy fix to them.
Sure. I think that's a good logic, right? I think that the people who study this kind of issue would say that, like, for example, when you fall into homelessness, that creates these kind of interlinked issues with mental health, lack of access to proper medical care. These kind of factors are strongly correlated with drug use, right? And so even if people are not necessarily abusing prescription opioids, certainly they may be more likely to abuse synthetic opioids like fentanyl, right? But that argument is so strong because you are not just then having to argue that economic decline outweighs saving lives from the opioid epidemic. You're arguing that your disadvantage turns the case by making the opioid epidemic worse.
Okay.
That is so incredibly strategic. Every single disadvantage that you read at the bottom of it, in the impact section, you need to think about how could this disadvantage turn the case? Because if you can win that argument, you make life for the affirmative very difficult. Because your negative rebuttal speech can begin with, "Judge, we have won this debate because we've established that the disadvantage turns the case." Even if they've won that the plan might have some benefit for reducing this impact, we've established that the disadvantages just cause those impacts to happen and recur anyway. It creates a situation where the impacts the plan claims to solve ultimately just become even more prominent. And that just totally destroys any affirmative if you're able to win. Disadvantage turns the case. Next, let's talk about the art of the time suck. What is a time suck?
I assume it's when you probably just waste time, and
Be more specific than that.
I think I would need a little bit more context.
So when you are the negative debater and you introduce an argument that is a time suck, what does that sound like to you?
That what you're about to talk about is going to take a lot of time, and you just kind of make that your core thing that you talk about for the entire speech.
Not quite. It's actually the opposite. The concept of a time suck kind of goes back to the gamesmanship aspect of debate. The idea, and it doesn't always need to be a literal time suck, but the idea is, as the negative, there are certain tools at your disposal that allow you to extract favorable time allocation differentials. That's a mouthful. Let me put it real simple. You read an argument that takes you 20 seconds to read, and it takes your opponent a minute and a half to answer. You've created a very favorable time allocation differential for yourself.
Okay.
So time suck arguments can be very helpful in the sense that they take relatively little time for you to argue, but a great deal of time for your opponent to answer in many cases. That said, strong debaters are familiar with these time sucks and they know how to minimize the time that is spent on them. But frequently, debaters at the level that we're at are not necessarily going to be the most sophisticated at navigating time suck kind of arguments. Let's talk about different kinds of time sucks. Procedural arguments are terrific time sucks. Because the thing with the procedural argument is your opponent is forced to answer it, and it can be an all or nothing argument, meaning if they lose it, they lose the debate. So a lot of debaters overcompensate by spending way more time to answer it than you spent to read it. Here's an example of a great specification argument. Agent specification. Have you heard of this before?
No.
So this is like, let's say the plan text is the United States federal government should, remove the patent for OxyContin or whatever. Agent specification is a theoretical argument that says interpretation, you have to specify who within the federal government is doing that. The violation is they don't. That's bad because one, it leads to a loss of predictability. We don't know what part of the government does this. And two, it creates a shifting target or moving target because we can't read our FDA overstretch argument because they never specified the FDA is doing the plan. So if we tried to read it, they could just say, oh, the FDA isn't doing it, and that screws us. That's a voting issue for fairness in education. Boom, that takes 20 seconds to read. Your opponent's going to get up there and maybe spend 90 seconds answering that. Is it a stupid argument? Yes. Are you likely to win it? No. But if your opponent drops it in front of the right judge, you could potentially manipulate that, right? So time sucks are really valuable for generating those kind of favorable time allocation trade-offs. Not because you plan to eventually argue that those time sucks are reasons to vote for you. In fact, quite the opposite. Typically, the time suck, you have little intention of actually arguing at the end of the debate. That's why you win. We'll talk more about that in a second. But they create favorable time trade-offs. That said, do not focus on time sucks to the exclusion of good arguments. Right? It's okay to run like one or two time sucks. the moment you go beyond that, you're just kind of shooting yourself in the foot because you're not giving yourself enough legitimate, good offense to win the debate with. So keep that in mind. Okay, so generate favorable time allocations. I mentioned procedurals are a good one. Another good one is to run very small, self-contained, substantive arguments on their own flow. You can think of these as being like a solvency press is a good example. It's just like a collection of like 3 or 4 solvency arguments that are very quick, very easy to make, and you just put them on a flow called solvency press, and you let your opponent just agonize over how much time to spend on it. That's not always a time suck in a traditional sense, because obviously you can concede some of those arguments and still have a chance, unlike a procedural where if you concede it, you risk losing the whole debate. But it is another type of argument that can help you generate those kind of favorable time trade-offs. What else? Know what you are good at. I really mean this in the sense that, like, once you've done enough debating, you're going to have a sense of like what your strengths are. Do everything in your power to design negative strategies and prep that cater to those strengths. Like when I was a debater, I had 2 very, very just two different kinds of arguments that I was just unusually strong at, that would dramatically increase the chances I could win a debate against a team that frankly had no business beating. Those 2 arguments were topicality and plan-inclusive counterplans, which are just that's a whole other conversation we'll save for the counterplans lecture. But I just knew that if I could find a way to run one or both of those things, the odds of me winning that debate would just skyrocket because I was a master at those arguments. So knowing what your strengths are and designing strategies to fit those strengths is really important. Generics. Oftentimes in the negative, we get a resolution and we're like, I have no idea what to say. This resolution is about something I've never heard of before. What the heck do I argue? The answer is you want to fall back on your generics. And generics are classifications of arguments that are very broadly generalizable to a large number of different kinds of different kinds of cases. So for example, topics that deal with international relations. You know, even if you don't know much about a particular country, you can always run pretty simple generics like State Department overstretch disadvantage or relations disadvantage with a specific country. Like, just the way that scenario works is, let's say, plan Texas to increase diplomatic engagement with, Saudi Arabia. Your disadvantage can be that's going to overstretch the State Department working on some other issue, and it's going to piss off some other country that doesn't like the Saudis, right? That's, in essence, your kind of template argument, not even template, just kind of your like standard generic arguments that don't require much thinking. You just already have them kind of prepped out. It makes it easier to deal with. Generics are really important for that reason. Another example is like with domestic topics, oftentimes, just having a generic economy disadvantage prepped, whether it's like a business confidence scenario or consumer confidence or just something like that. That can be really a really handy thing to have in your toolkit. Keep in mind that some generics are just simply going to struggle because of a lack of uniqueness. So for example, while it is true that virtually every plan will create some kind of spending and that there are disadvantages to spending too much money, the size of the deficit means it's going to be a drop in the bucket and they're going to have an uphill battle winning a disadvantage based on spending being bad. So just be mindful of that. But that is certainly something that you can consider. Um, let's talk about the art of collapsing in debate. The most common mistake that I see negative debaters make later in the debate is they go for everything. Every argument they introduce somehow ends up in the final speech. That is a terrible mistake. It's hard to fight the impulse to not go for everything, but it is ultimately always in your best interest to pick and choose the combination of arguments that are most likely to lead to a winning ballot. And it is always more desirable to do this because you are going to have the ability to take the strongest argument and maximize the amount of time that you spend on them. This kind of goes back to the time suck discussion that we were having. If you read a 30-second argument as a time suck, the odds of that argument being on its own good enough to win you the debate are just vanishingly slim, right? Because you just haven't invested enough time in it. So rather than, spend time on an argument that's probably a lost cause, you should do something called kicking the argument. So let's say you ran your A-spec argument, the opponent spent 90 seconds answering it, you get to your member of opposition constructive, the first words out of your mouth should be, "We are not going for this A-spec argument, extend their we meet or whatever. This is not a voting issue, let's move on." You acknowledge it, but you dispense of it by essentially saying this argument does not matter and does not factor into your decision. That's objection. You do have to be a little bit careful because there are some judges who are a bit less sophisticated, who are just making decisions quite literally based on counting, oh, you won this many arguments, they won this many arguments. You gotta be careful, right? So probably don't even read A-spec in front of that judge in the first place. But for a judge who is reasonably well-versed in how debate works, that's almost always the best call. So collapsing is really important because it condenses the debate down into those things that you are most ahead on and that you are most likely to win, and it dramatically increases pressure on the affirmative. Think about also, what are the combinations of arguments that make sense as a coherent pattern? So a classic example, you may have heard the phrase suicide tea before. Tea being topicality.
Yeah.
Suicide tea, and the name is ridiculous, and I do not like that it trivializes the word suicide, but it is the word that it is known by. It is simply where the negative goes all in on topicality, and they do not go for any other argument. It's, I would say, rare in parliamentary debate. It does happen, but it's rare. But the reason that some people's objection to suicide tea is they get all defensive and they're like, well, what if I lose topicality? I have nothing else. I lose this debate. To which I answer, well, yeah, no shit. You're going to lose because you lost the argument. But there is such a thing in debate as spreading yourself so thin that by going for, multiple arguments, that's not increasing your chances of winning the debate, it's decreasing it, right? People get the sense that they don't want to put all their eggs in one basket because that's the advice that we give them for the constructive speech. But realistically, the data show over and over and over, your chances of winning are highest when you spend the most amount of time on the arguments you are the farthest ahead on. And so consequently, the way to maximize that time is simply to not discuss the issues that don't matter. Get them out of the way, focus on the things that do matter. Collapse. Collapse, collapse, collapse. Let's talk about advanced framing in the leader of the opposition rebuttal, the last negative speech. Two things: comparison and prioritization. Here's what I mean by this. Comparison is essentially the art of rejoinder. So in argumentation theory, we often talk about the three different burdens. We talk about the burden of proof, the burden of refutation, and then the burden of rejoinder. The burden of proof is simply, if you make an argument, you have to back it up. The burden of refutation is once your opponent has met the burden of proof, you then have the burden to respond to it. The burden of rejoinder is the third and the final burden, and that is that when both sides have presented their arguments, rejoinder involves the comparison of the two. In other words, I think a very telltale sign of a younger, less experienced debater is when they don't do rejoinder. In the last speech, instead, they focus on reiterating or summarizing what was already said without actually comparing what has been said. There is a place for summarizing in rebuttal speeches, but ultimately, you win not by restating what you've already said, but by explaining why your argument is stronger than your opponent's argument. They said this, we said this, here's why our argument is preferable. That's such a critical skill to have because it enables you to get beyond just summarizing what was said. Remember that the judge has been keeping notes. They already know what was said, right? So any summary should really be limited just to reminding people what you're talking about. If I see a speech as a judge that is just summary, it makes me have to do a lot more work to do the rejoinder myself, and I do not like to do that. It's intervening, right? It's me using my own judgment rather than you as a debater making those judgments for me. So in essence, I guess at a very top level overview of what we've discussed the importance of not getting tunnel vision with prep and the ability to kind of do it live, the importance of focusing on the case, the importance of finding arguments that turn the case, whether it be a disadvantage or a value counter contention, I guess you could use it then, knowing what you're good at, forcing time trade-offs, and we've talked about the larger strategic decisions that you make toward the end of a debate to steer the debate most in your favor. Any other questions about negative strategy?
I just had one about when you were talking about collapsing. You mentioned to kick the arguments that just don't matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
How would I kind of frame that? Because I don't want to make it seem like I'm dropping the argument, but I want to acknowledge it, but then not seem like I'm dropping the argument.
So kicking an argument is distinct from dropping it, because kicking an argument is where you explicitly acknowledge that you are making the choice to drop an argument.
Okay.
And you explicitly acknowledge that you are doing that so as to remove any doubt in the judge's mind that you are just, forgetting something. But kicking an argument has to be done carefully, because if it's done improperly, a smart affirmative team can revive it from the dead and continue to use it against you. A classic example, let's say you run a disadvantage, the opponent turns the disadvantage, can you then kick it? And just say, oh, never mind, we can't do that anymore.
No.
You cannot kick it because the affirmative has offense that has to be resolved. If you go back to that opioid economy disadvantage example, so let's say the disadvantage is that the plan is bad for the economy, you create pharmaceutical uncertainty or whatever, and then the affirmative is just all in on actually the plan is great for the economy. As a negative, you can't just let that go. If you think the affirmative is overwhelmingly ahead, the way that you kick it is you have to identify a defensive argument the affirmative made and say, extend their defensive argument. That means this doesn't matter anymore. So, for example, let's say the affirmative, in addition to all these link turns, they argued, well, even if there's an economic collapse, there's no impact to that, it doesn't really matter. It's such a small decline in the economy that there won't be any noticeable impact. As a negative, you could say, extend that argument. That means that even if they improve the economy, there's no impact to it. And since it's an argument that they made, they can't just turn around and contradict themselves.
Got it, because that would be...
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to kick that argument, you say, on the econ dissad, extend their argument. There's no impact on the economy. We are not going for this argument. We are choosing to focus on something else in this debate that we're going to win. Next argument.
Got it.
So that's how you cleanly kick an argument. With procedurals, you really generally don't have to worry about that. And that's why procedurals are so great for times X. There is something called an RVI, or a reverse voting issue. Is that a phrase you've heard?
No.
RVIs are stupid. I'm just gonna say this outright. They're stupid. They do not belong in debate. An RVI is essentially an argument where the affirmative says, oh, this should be a reverse voting issue because they're trying to waste time. You should punish them by voting against them if they don't win this argument. That is literally an RVI. So if they make that argument, then as the negative, if you're going to kick it, you basically have to say RVIs are not a thing. There's no reason to vote against us. Like, just I can go in a little more detail about that when I talk about procedurals, but it's just just listen for that. But as long as there's no RVI, you can freely kick out of procedural arguments at any time.